Maasai Reserve. Late morning. The heat had begun to press down over the open plain, the kind that settles into the ground and slows every movement. From the edge of the grassland, a young male lion stepped into view, his gait uneven. His back leg dragged through the dust, toes curling inward as if the weight was too much to carry. The fur along his flank was matted and dark, a slow line of blood seeping downward, catching the light in brief, dull glints. Daniel, one of the reserve's senior rangers, had been scanning the area from a low ridge. At first glance, the lion's presence seemed unremarkable. Males sometimes roamed alone in these parts, but the way he moved, each step hesitant and tilted, was a clear sign that something was wrong. Daniel began walking, keeping his distance to avoid startling the animal. The lion's head hung low, and his tail brushed the ground rather than flicking against flies. The faint sway of his ribs showed shallow breathing. Every few meters he would stop, his body sagging as if the effort of standing pulled at whatever injury lay hidden beneath the tangled fur. Daniel could see the wound more clearly now, a jagged tear, deep enough that the muscle beneath seemed exposed, the edges raw and inflamed. The pattern was uneven, not clean like a predator's bite. It looked more like something mechanical had caught him, wire perhaps, or the teeth of a crude trap. He paused about 30 meters away, watching the lion's eyes shift without lifting his head. The animal was aware of him but made no move to retreat. That stillness was not trust. It was exhaustion. In the wild, a lion in this state was days, perhaps hours from collapse. Without the strength to hunt, dehydration and infection would do the rest. The stakes were simple. If the animal moved too far, the wound would tear. If he stayed where he was, the heat and flies would finish the work. Daniel lowered himself slightly, letting his frame seem smaller. "Easy, boy," he said quietly, the words more tone than meaning. The lion blinked once, his gaze fixed on the ground. Daniel's eyes swept the surrounding grass, noting there was no pride nearby. A lone male in poor condition was unlikely to have allies, and more likely to be driven off by stronger rivals. Each moment out here increased the risk of an encounter he couldn't survive. A gust of wind lifted the edge of the lion's mane, revealing more blood crusted along his shoulder. The scent would carry far. Daniel knew he had to close the distance carefully, without triggering the last of the animal's energy in a panicked retreat. Every step was measured, the sound of his boots softened by the dust. The lion swayed once, bracing against his good legs, then eased himself onto his haunches. It was not a position of rest, but one of necessity. Standing had become too costly. In the distance, heat shimmered over the horizon, making the line between grass and sky blur. The only movement was the slow turn of the lion's ears, tracking the buzz of insects and the faint crunch of Daniel's approach. The ranger stopped within 20 meters, close enough to study the injury in detail. The wound was still bleeding, though sluggishly. It was the wrong color, a dull, unhealthy red, and the flesh around it had begun to swell. Infection was already taking hold. If the lion bolted now, Daniel wouldn't catch him. If he lay down fully, there might be no getting him back up. Both choices meant the same end. What was needed was a way to keep him still but safe, to hold the fragile balance between his failing body and the short window in which help could arrive. The reserve team had treated lions before, but rarely this far out, and never with the animal in such a weakened state. The lion shifted again, lowering his chest toward the ground. His breathing quickened for a few seconds, then slowed, each exhale catching at the end. Daniel waited, knowing that in the next moments the decision of how to move him would have to be made. Overhead, a single vulture turned in a wide circle, patient as the sun. Daniel took another slow step forward, keeping his body angled so he didn't face the lion head-on. The air was heavy with the smell of dust and old blood. Each movement sent faint ripples through the grass, the sound nearly lost in the steady hum of insects. The lion's ears twitched at the approach, a small acknowledgement, but his head stayed low, chin nearly touching the dry earth. His breathing was shallow, the sides of his chest rising and falling in a rhythm too quick for rest. Daniel spoke again. A few low words meant only to carry calm, not meaning. The lion's gaze shifted slightly, not to meet him, but to track the sound. He could see the wound clearly now. Just above the haunch, the fur was gone in a ragged circle, replaced by swollen flesh torn in uneven lines. It was the kind of damage Daniel had seen before, the cruel work of a steel-jawed trap meant for smaller animals. The metal teeth left their signature, deep, serrated bruises where pressure had crushed muscle and cut skin in a single snap. The edges were crusted but still moist in places, each drop of blood drawing more flies. They clustered thickly, a restless black halo that shifted whenever the lion's tail gave a weak twitch. Daniel kept closing the distance, counting each step as if measuring the space between safety and disaster. 10 meters. The lion's shoulders rose slightly, the only sign he might consider standing, but the back leg gave a small, involuntary spasm. If he ran now, the wound could tear wider. If it severed muscle, there would be no recovery. That reality was plain in Daniel's mind, as stark as the heat pressing on his neck. He crouched slowly, lowering his profile to match the lion's level. The scent of blood was stronger here, mingled with the dry, metallic tang of old iron, a ghost of the trap itself. Daniel's eyes followed the curve of the leg, noting the swelling that reached almost to the joint. Moving him without care would risk more damage. The challenge was not just reaching the lion, it was convincing him to remain still long enough to help. The wind shifted, brushing the tall grass in waves. A small patch of shade drifted across the lion's body before moving on. The animal didn't react. His eyes half closed, lids heavy, but the ears still moved in small arcs, searching for sound. Every few seconds his tail lifted slightly before falling again, a fading habit of swatting away insects. Daniel set his pack down quietly, easing the strap from his shoulder so it wouldn't snap back with sound. He let his hands rest open on his knees, showing no threat. The lion's chest expanded once in a deeper breath, then settled back into its strained rhythm. Daniel could see the ribs clearly between each rise, a sign of weight lost, days without proper food. If the lion bolted into the grass, the wound would open further with every stride. If he stayed too long in the open, he would draw the attention of scavengers or other males. The balance was as thin as the line of dust now clinging to the edge of his mane. Daniel's task was to keep him in that space long enough for help to matter. He inched forward another meter, the ground crunching softly under his boots. The lion's eyes opened a fraction wider, following the movement without lifting his head. Daniel spoke again, just a murmur. "Easy, boy." The words disappeared into the heat, leaving only the steady hum of flies and the shallow pull of air through the lion's lungs. The next step would be the hardest. Not reaching him, but deciding how to move a creature that could end his life in seconds, yet was closer to death than he realized. Daniel glanced toward the horizon, scanning for the dust trail of the reserve's vehicle. There was nothing but heat shimmer, the air thick enough to hide anything beyond a few hundred meters. Even if he called for backup now, it would take too long. The lion's breathing had grown shallower, each exhale slower to follow. The ground beneath his side was darkened where blood had seeped and dried. Waiting here would mean losing him before help arrived. That left only one choice. He eased his pack open, pulling out the heavy canvas blanket he carried for immobilizations and shade. Kneeling close, he slid the edge along the ground toward the lion's belly. The animal gave a faint huff, ears angling back, but did not move. Daniel kept his movements deliberate, avoiding sudden shifts. The blanket's coarse weave rasped against the dry grass as he worked it under the lion's torso, inch by inch. The mane brushed his forearm coarse and warm, carrying the scent of sun and dust. The lion's eyes half opened, the gold dulled by fatigue. His tail gave a small twitch but fell limp again. Daniel knew that if the animal chose to fight now, there would be nothing he could do. But there was no tension in the muscles under the blanket, only the loose heaviness of exhaustion. The real challenge was still ahead, getting him up without tearing the leg further. Daniel shifted his stance, crouching low, knees bent under the weight he was about to take. He gathered the blanket ends in both hands, tightening the wrap until it was snug around the lion's chest and midsection. His pulse quickened. He could feel the solid weight pressing against his thighs before he'd even begun to lift. Moving too fast could jolt the injury. Moving too slow could drain what strength the lion had left. With a steady breath, he leaned forward, sliding his arms beneath the wrapped body. The sudden heaviness was immediate and complete. A dense, living weight that settled across his back and shoulders. The heat from the lion's body soaked through the blanket, matched by the warmth of blood where the fabric touched the wound. Daniel rose in stages, keeping his legs steady, his back straight to avoid shifting the animal. The lion's head hung over his shoulder, the mane brushing against his arm. Daniel could feel the faint vibration of breath against his skin, each one a reminder that the balance was fragile. Every step had to be measured. Deliberate, cushioned so the injured leg wouldn't jolt. The first few meters felt impossible, each foot sinking slightly into the dust, each shift of weight demanding careful adjustment to keep the lion stable. Daniel paused once to adjust the grip, tightening the blanket hold without letting the animal slide. The flies still hovered, following them in a loose cloud, and the sun pressed down, drawing sweat in steady lines down his back. The distance to camp was just under 2 kilometers. But with the load on his shoulders, it stretched in his mind like a long ridge with no end. Stopping for too long could let the lion slip into deeper shock. Moving too quickly could exhaust Daniel before he reached shade. Every step mattered. He set his eyes on the narrow line of a game path winding between patches of brush, aiming for its smoother ground. The lion stayed still, the trust or surrender impossible to read, but his breathing held steady against Daniel's ear. That rhythm became the pace. 1 step for each slow inhale, 1 for each exhale. Behind them, the grass swayed back into place, erasing the trail, leaving only the weight of the decision pressing into Daniel's shoulders as he carried the animal toward the thin promise of safety. The game path narrowed between low thorn scrub, its pale sand scattering under Daniel's boots. The lion's weight pressed evenly across his shoulders, a living anchor that pulled at every step. The air felt close. The midday heat turning still and heavy. Sweat ran in slow lines down his spine, soaking into the waistband of his trousers, and the fabric of his shirt clung to his skin where dust had settled in a fine, gritty layer. Each breath he took seemed to warm rather than cool him. Every 20 paces he paused, shifting his stance to steady the load while his ears tuned to the lion's breathing. The sound was shallow but regular, warm against the side of his neck. Once it quickened, and Daniel froze in place, holding his own breath until the rhythm steadied again. Moving too far without rest could push the animal into shock. Stopping too long risked the sun draining what little strength remained. The thorn branches reached inward along the path, catching at the blanket and brushing against the lion's mane. Daniel adjusted his steps to avoid them, angling his body so the injured leg stayed clear. The blanket was darkening in a patch near the wound, the dampness warm against his back. Flies followed them in a drifting swarm, lifting and settling again with each shift in the air. A small rise lay ahead, its slope gradual but steady. Daniel leaned forward slightly, digging his heels into the sand for grip. The lion's head shifted with the change in angle, his mane brushing Daniel's cheek. The weight felt heavier now, as if the climb had drawn more of it downward. He kept his eyes on the path, counting steps to measure progress. 50 to the top, then a long stretch of level ground where the wind moved faintly between the grasses. The silence of the reserve was broken only by the soft crunch of his boots and the faint rhythmic sigh of the lion's breath. Every so often the tail twitched once against his hip, not in resistance but as a reflex, the last flicker of habit in a body that had little left to give. Daniel let the pace settle into a rhythm, steady and unbroken, matching each footfall to the slow cycle of breathing on his back. Halfway along the flat, a patch of shade appeared where a lone acacia reached over the path. Daniel stopped beneath it, lowering his knees slightly to ease the weight without setting the lion down. The break lasted less than a minute. The air here was cooler, but not enough to risk losing momentum. He shifted his grip on the blanket, drew in one slow breath, and moved on. The horizon began to change, a faint line of darker green where the camp's tree line marked the edge of the open plain. It was still distant, but it gave shape to the route ahead. Daniel's legs ached, the muscles in his shoulders tight and burning, but the rhythm held. The lion's breathing stayed steady, shallow but unbroken. If they stopped here for more than a few minutes, the sun would win. If they pushed too fast, the injury could open again. The balance was narrow, and Daniel kept to it as if each step was a bridge between the two outcomes. He didn't look back. The only thing that mattered was the ground ahead and the faint promise of shade that meant the difference between losing the animal on his back and giving him a chance to live. The shade of the camp's central awning felt like stepping into another world. Daniel's legs trembled as he lowered to one knee, easing the lion's body from his shoulders onto the waiting arms of the veterinary team. The canvas platform had been pulled into the deepest shadow, its surface layered with thick pads to soften the pressure on the injured side. The lion's head hung for a moment before it found the support of the cloth, eyes half closed, breathing still shallow but steady. Hands moved in silent coordination. One ranger held the blanket edges apart while another steadied the animal's forequarters. The lead vet, Miriam, knelt immediately at the wound, gloved fingers tracing its outline with care. The jagged tear was raw and swollen, the edges dark with dirt and dried blood. She spoke low to her assistant, calling for saline and antiseptic, then began flushing the injury. Clear fluid ran over the exposed muscle, carrying with it fine grains of grit that caught the light before pooling dark beneath the platform. Daniel stepped back, watching the slow, deliberate process. The lion stirred once, his head lifting from the pad just enough for their eyes to meet across the narrow space. It was only a second, gold locking on brown, before the weight of his head pulled him back down. The message was unclear, but the moment rooted itself in Daniel's chest. The team worked quickly but without haste, pausing whenever the lion's breathing shifted into uneven bursts. Cotton pads darkened as they blotted the wound, each one discarded into a growing pile at the edge of the work table. The swelling around the leg was worse than Daniel had realized. The skin stretched tight and hot under the vet's hand. Miriam's brow tightened as she examined the deeper tissue, searching for signs of muscle damage. If the infection reached the bloodstream, no amount of medicine would be enough to stop it. That reality hung over every movement, the careful irrigation, the slow trimming of ragged fur around the injury to keep flies away, the measured injections of antibiotics and pain relief. Each action was a race against what was already moving unseen beneath the surface. One ranger held a broad leaf fan, stirring the air to keep insects from landing. The lion's ears twitched in small, weary motions, his tail lifting once before falling still again. His forepaws shifted slightly on the pad, claws sliding a fraction from their sheaths before settling back. The weight of exhaustion was plain in every gesture. When the wound was clean, Miriam began applying a medicated dressing, the white bandage wrapping snugly over the worst of the tear without cutting off circulation. She checked the lion's pulse, her fingers resting lightly at the hollow beneath his jaw. Satisfied with the rhythm, she gave a small nod, and the team began to step back. Daniel moved closer, crouching near the platform's edge. The lion's eyes opened a fraction, focusing on him again before slipping shut. The rise and fall of his chest was steady, but faint, each breath a reminder of how close they were to losing him. They had bought time, but nothing more. If the medicine took hold, the lion might stand again in days. If it failed, this shaded corner of camp would be the last ground he touched. Daniel stayed where he was a moment longer, watching the slow movement of the animal's ribs before stepping away to let the team keep vigil through the heat of the afternoon. By the second morning, the light under the camp's awning was softer, filtered through the pale canvas and the slow drift of leaves beyond. The lion lay stretched on his uninjured side, the bandage around his haunch clean but already loosening with the small shifts of his body. His breathing had deepened since that first night, each inhale fuller, though still careful. Daniel stood a few paces away, arms loosely crossed, watching for any sign that the restlessness he had seen building would turn into movement. The lion's tail twitched twice, then stilled. His forepaws pressed lightly into the pad beneath him, claws showing briefly as if testing the ground. Daniel could see the muscles in his shoulders tighten, then relax. A low exhale followed, and for a moment it seemed he might settle back into stillness. But then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he rolled forward and tucked his forelegs beneath his chest. Daniel's stance shifted unconsciously, his weight coming forward on his toes. The injured leg slid awkwardly across the pad as the lion began to push up. For a heartbeat he held there, half risen, head lifted but body trembling with the effort. The bandaged limb hovered, refusing the full press of weight. When it touched down, the joint bent sharply and gave way, dropping him back against the padding. The lion's sides heaved, the failed effort pulling more from him than Daniel liked to see. But there had been no panic in the movement. Only trial, the cautious testing of strength returning. The will to stand was there, buried under the weakness of muscles that had been still too long. Minutes passed before the lion tried again. This time he pushed with his forelegs first, raising his chest from the ground before carefully shifting weight back. Daniel stepped closer, voice low, steady. "Easy, boy." The sound was quiet enough not to break the lion's focus, just a thread in the air between them. The hind legs moved in sequence, the uninjured one bracing firmly, the bandaged one dragging slightly until it found its place beneath him. For a moment his stance was crooked, the front half of his body upright while the rear swayed. Then the injured leg buckled again, but not fully. He caught himself, claws raking lightly against the pad, shoulders stiffening to take some of the weight. Daniel could see the calculation in his balance. Too much pressure on the injury would undo everything, but keeping it lifted would keep it from healing. The lion's head turned slightly, eyes narrowing as he steadied himself. A long breath left him, and then, with a shift so small it was almost invisible, he moved one forepaw forward. It was only a single step, unsteady, slow, the back leg dragging behind, but it was forward. The muscles along his spine tightened to keep him upright, and for a moment he stood fully, both hind legs grounded, his weight distributed enough to hold. Daniel let the silence stretch, not wanting to break the fragile balance with sound. The lion's ears flicked toward the camp's distant noises, the soft clang of a pot, the faint call of a bird from the river. But his eyes stayed ahead, on nothing in particular. After a few seconds he lowered himself back to the pad, the motion controlled and deliberate. His chest rose and fell with the effort, but there was no collapse this time. The first step was taken. Small as it was, it meant the difference between an animal that might never walk again and one that could return to the grass. Now the question was whether there would be another, stronger than the last, before the sun set on this fragile recovery. A week later, the camp was quiet in the pale light just after sunrise. The air held the cool edge of night, but the promise of heat lay close behind. Daniel stood beside the wooden gate of the holding pen, one hand resting on the latch. Beyond the slats, the lion paced slowly, his movements smoother now, the limp still visible but no longer threatening to topple him. The bandage had been removed 2 days earlier, replaced by a thin line of scar tissue that pulled slightly at the skin when he walked. The ground inside the pen was worn from his circles, each lap a patient rebuild of muscle and balance. This morning, the pacing had stopped. The lion stood near the gate, head high, eyes fixed on the sweep of grass beyond. His breathing was calm, the steady rise and fall of a body no longer fighting to hold itself together. Daniel lifted the latch and stepped back. The gate swung open with a low groan, leaving nothing between the lion and the wild that had shaped him. For a moment he did not move, the tip of his tail making a slow arc in the air. Then he stepped forward, each paw pressing into the soft earth with quiet certainty. The injured leg moved with him, no longer held back or shielded, bearing weight in measured rhythm with the rest. The path from the pen led into a shallow dip where the grass grew thick and green from recent rains. The lion paused there, his frame outlined against the rising light. He scanned the horizon, head turning slowly from one end of the plain to the other. The land was open and unbroken, save for the distant shimmer of trees marking the river's edge. Daniel stayed where he was, letting the space between them widen. The lion's ears turned briefly in his direction, catching the faint sounds of camp behind, but he did not look back. Instead, he moved on, his stride steady, tail lifting slightly with each step. The line of his shoulders no longer sagged, and the swaying limp had softened into something that might one day vanish entirely. The grass closed around his legs, bending under his weight and springing back as he passed. The sun climbed higher, washing the plain in gold, and the dark shape of the lion grew smaller with distance. Daniel kept watching until the movement was little more than a ripple in the grass, indistinguishable from the wind. The wild was waiting for him, and he answered without hesitation. Whatever came next would be written out there, beyond the reach of camp, where the scars of survival were just another part of the land. Daniel turned back toward the gate, the smell of grass and dust still fresh in the air, carrying with it the knowledge that the ground the lion walked now was his own again. 3 days after the release, Daniel was patrolling a stretch of open plain where the grass ran in long, wind-brushed waves. The sun had already burned away the coolness of morning, and the horizon wavered with heat. He had almost passed the last rise before the river when movement caught his eye. A shape low against the grass, moving with the unhurried rhythm of an animal at ease. The lion emerged from the ripple of yellow stalks, his mane darker now with dust and the faint sheen of good health. The limp was still there if you looked for it, but it no longer broke the line of his stride. Each step landed with quiet purpose, weight carried evenly enough that the old injury seemed part of him rather than a burden. His ribs were less visible, the hollows of hunger slowly filling. Daniel stopped where he was, letting the distance remain. The wind carried the faint scent of dry earth and animal musk, familiar and grounding. The lion's head lifted, ears turning toward the sound of boots settling in the grass. For a moment, their eyes found each other across the space, the same gold Daniel had seen on the table under the awning, dulled then by exhaustion, now sharpened by the sun. The pause lasted only a few heartbeats. The lion blinked once, slow, before looking past him toward the line of trees in the distance. Without changing pace, he angled away, his mane catching small flashes of light as he passed through taller grass. The space between them widened with each step until he was no more than a shape in the heat haze, then only the sway of stalks marking where he had gone. Daniel stayed still, watching the last sign of movement fade. The land returned to its steady hum. Insects hidden in the grass, the faint rustle of wind, the far-off call of a bird over the river. The lion was gone, but the image of that meeting stayed, clear and weighted. The memory of his weight on Daniel's back was just as sharp, the strain in his shoulders, the slow, deliberate steps that had carried them both through the long heat. That moment, like the brief glance across the grass now, would not fade. It was a part of the plain, a part of Daniel, bound to the knowledge that sometimes survival was measured in the space between two sets of footprints. He turned back toward the patrol route, the light shifting on the grass ahead, knowing the lion would walk his own path from here. The land had taken him back, and Daniel carried only the quiet certainty that it had been worth every step.